Welcome back to Stories That Heal, where powerful moments of kindness and connection take center stage. In today's story, an unexpected confrontation between Barron Trump and a struggling stranger in a bustling cafe leads to a life-changing conversation. What begins as anger transforms into an extraordinary moment of understanding that leaves everyone speechless. Stay tuned as we dive into this emotional journey that shows how empathy can bridge even the widest gaps. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire. The cafe on the corner of a bustling Philadelphia street was a haven of warmth and tranquility. Outside, the breezy afternoon carried the scents of the city. Freshly baked pretzels from a street vendor mingled with the faint tang of car exhaust. Inside, the scene was idyllic, the soft hum of conversation, the occasional clink of a ceramic mug against a table, and the hiss of the espresso machine creating a symphony of calm for those seeking solace. Near the window, Barron Trump sat alone, his tall frame folded over a thick book. A plain hoodie and jeans gave him an unassuming look, one he had carefully chosen to blend into the crowd. For someone whose life had been a whirlwind of public attention, this simple moment of anonymity was precious. The cafe was filled with patrons who were either too engrossed in their phones or their conversations to notice the young man reading quietly. For once, Barron felt like just another face in the crowd. But peace is a fragile thing. A sharp, accusatory voice sliced through the ambient noise like a knife, bringing the soft chatter and clinking cups to an abrupt halt. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" Heads turned, conversation ceased, and the barista behind the counter froze mid-step, a tray of steaming cups in her hands. The voice belonged to a man who had stormed into the cafe, his fiery expression drawing every eye. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a weathered face and the kind of posture that spoke of a life weighed down by hardship. His clothes, though not tattered, bore the unmistakable wear of someone who had seen tough times. The man's anger was directed squarely at Barron, who glanced up from his book, momentarily startled. He hadn't anticipated this. In fact, he had chosen this corner cafe specifically because it seemed like the kind of place where anonymity thrived, a refuge from the scrutiny he so often endured. Now all eyes were on him, and the air in the cafe grew thick with tension. "You've got everything handed to you on a silver platter," the man continued, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" Barron's initial reaction wasn't fear, it was surprise, followed by a measured calm. He slowly closed his book, placing it gently on the table, and looked up at the man. There was no hostility in his expression, no trace of defensiveness. If anything, his face reflected quiet curiosity and a touch of concern. The room held its collective breath. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or wait to see what would happen. Some looked to the barista, who hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone as though preparing to call for help. Barron finally spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "Sir," he began, his tone calm, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed loudly, his body tense with barely contained rage. "Talk? You want to talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" The tension in the room tightened like a coiled spring. The barista took a small step forward, as though preparing to intervene, but Barron's response stopped her. Instead of matching the man's aggression, Barron leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed yet attentive. "Please," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, "sit." The simplicity of the invitation caught the man off guard. For a moment, the anger in his eyes flickered with something else. Confusion, perhaps even hesitation. But his shoulders remained tense, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you?" he sneered. "You're just another spoiled kid who'll never know what it's like to live in the real world." A ripple of discomfort spread through the cafe. A few patrons shifted uneasily in their seats, whispering to one another. The barista's gaze darted nervously between Barron and the man, weighing whether to step in. Barron, however, remained calm. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice measured. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." The man faltered, his body language betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Barron's words weren't a challenge. They were an invitation, a genuine offer to listen. "You think I owe you my story?" the man snapped, his voice quieter now but no less sharp. "You think that'll make you feel better about yourself?" Barron's gaze didn't waver. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he replied. His words hung in the air, cutting through the heavy silence of the café. Patrons leaned in slightly, their curiosity now mingled with an odd sense of hope. They weren't sure where this was going, but they couldn't look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man grabbed the back of the empty chair and dragged it noisily across the floor. He dropped into the seat, crossing his arms defensively. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning Barron as if searching for a crack in his calm demeanor. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The café collectively exhaled, the suffocating tension easing just slightly. The barista lowered her hand from the phone, her shoulders relaxing. The patrons, though trying to appear uninterested, couldn't help but lean in, pretending to sip their coffee while listening intently. Barron nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I'm listening," he said simply. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as though testing Barron's sincerity. Then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. What followed wasn't just a rant. It was a window into a life filled with struggle and loss, each word laden with bitterness and pain. The café, once filled with the hum of casual chatter, now held only the sound of the man's voice and the faint hiss of the espresso machine. Every patron, every employee, every passerby who had stopped to peek inside could feel the weight of what was unfolding. And yet, through it all, Barron's calm, unwavering attention remained. The man's anger burned brightly, but for the first time it had found a quiet place to land. The man's voice started rough and angry, like gravel scraping against concrete. Yet, as he spoke, it softened. Not because the anger was gone, but because the weight of his story began to overshadow it. He leaned back in his chair, his arms still crossed, his gaze darting around the café as though daring someone to judge him. But no one spoke. The patrons were transfixed, their cups forgotten, their gazes carefully averted, but their ears attuned to every word. "You look at me," the man began, his voice trembling with barely contained frustration, "and you see someone angry for no reason, but you don't know what it's like to lose everything." He paused, his fingers drumming on the table as if trying to ground himself. His shoulders rose and fell with a heavy breath, and for the first time, his eyes locked onto Barron's with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "I had a job, a good one. Worked at the same factory for 15 years, doing honest work, putting food on the table. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough." His lips curled into a bitter smile. Until one day, it wasn't. The factory shut down. No warning, no severance. Just a bunch of empty promises that they'd relocate us. Promises that never came true. The café was silent except for the faint hiss of the espresso machine and the occasional clink of a spoon against a saucer. Barron leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. His expression remained steady, open. "What happened then?" he asked, his tone quiet but deliberate, as if his question carried more than mere curiosity. The man laughed dryly, shaking his head. "What do you think happened?" he snapped, though his voice lacked the sharpness it had carried earlier. "I tried to hold it together. Took odd jobs, worked late hours doing whatever I could find. But when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you." He paused, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "And it did. My wife. She couldn't take it anymore. She left, took the kids and went to her sister's place. Said she couldn't live like that." His voice cracked, and for a moment, The bravado he had carried into the cafe seemed to crumble. He glanced at the table, his gaze tracing the grain of the wood as if it might hold some answers. "I can't even blame her," he murmured, barely loud enough to be heard. What kind of life was I giving them? Barron's face was unreadable, but his eyes softened. He didn't rush to speak or try to fill the silence, letting the man's words linger in the air. Around them, the other patrons shifted in their seats, their earlier discomfort replaced by quiet empathy. A woman at a nearby table stared into her coffee cup, her expression pensive, while a man at the counter adjusted his glasses, pretending to read his newspaper, but clearly listening. The man exhaled sharply, his hands running through his graying hair. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone's looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing?" His voice grew louder, though it wasn't directed at Barron alone. "That's my life now, every single day." The weight of his words pressed down on the room. Even those who had tried to appear uninterested couldn't hide their reactions anymore. The barista paused mid-step, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten, as if frozen by the gravity of his story. The man's gaze returned to Barron, his expression hardening. "And then I see someone like you," he said, his voice rising again, "sitting here in your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. It makes me mad, because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." His accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged. Barron didn't flinch. He didn't bristle or defend himself. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his hands folded loosely together. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," Barron said softly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the words land like a calming tide. "But I do know what it's like to feel judged, to feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even said a word." The man's eyes narrowed, his mouth opening as if to object, but no words came. Instead, he stared at Barron, his skepticism battling with something else, something softer, quieter, and more uncertain. "What could you possibly know about that?" the man asked finally, his tone carrying more exhaustion than anger. Barron took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "You might think I've got it easy because of my name," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. "And in some ways, you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table. But that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to feel misunderstood." The man scoffed, his skepticism bubbling back to the surface. But Barron held up a hand, not in a dismissive way, but as if to say, "Let me finish." "Everywhere I go," Barron continued, "people make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am, what I believe, what I've done, just because of my last name. They don't see me as a person. They see a caricature, someone they can project their own frustrations onto." He paused, his voice lowering just enough to draw the man in closer. "Kind of like what's happening here." The man's jaw tightened, his arms loosening slightly from their defensive cross. His posture shifted, ever so subtly, from confrontation to contemplation. Barron's tone remained measured, genuine. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours. They're not. But pain is pain. Feeling invisible, feeling like you'll never be understood. That's something we all face, no matter where we come from." The cafe was utterly silent now, the kind of silence that feels thick with thought. Even the barista, who had been inching toward the phone earlier, stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the table near the window. Barron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to absorb his words. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said. "I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand, because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees. And maybe, just maybe, we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did." The man stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. It seemed like he might lash out again, the tension in his clenched jaw still visible. But then, almost imperceptibly, he exhaled, a sharp, heavy breath that felt like the release of something he'd been holding on to for far too long. "You really believe that?" the man asked, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. Barron nodded. "I do. And I think maybe, deep down, you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have told me your story." The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking just a little more. For the first time, he didn't seem angry. He just seemed tired. As he sat back in his chair, his body language shifted from defensive to contemplative, the fire in his eyes replaced by something softer. He looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge absent-mindedly. The tension in the cafe eased, though the weight of the moment remained. The man didn't respond right away, but something in his posture spoke volumes. Slowly, a flicker of self-awareness crossed his face, a realization that this conversation was about more than just anger. It was about connection, however fragile or unexpected. The cafe seemed to hold its breath as the man sat in silence, his fingers still tracing the grain of the wooden table. Around them, patrons who had been furtively watching leaned in slightly, their curiosity mingled with something deeper, an unspoken hope that this tense encounter might end in something meaningful. Finally, the man looked up at Barron, his expression a mixture of weariness and reluctant understanding. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his tone softer, almost contemplative. The bitterness in his voice had dulled, replaced by a raw honesty that felt as fragile as it was powerful. Barron didn't respond right away. He let the man's words linger, respecting their weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and calm, but there was a warmth in it, a quiet reassurance. "Sometimes, the way we see people isn't about them at all," he said. "It's about what we're carrying. I think we all do it, in our own way." The man's jaw tightened for a moment, as though he were wrestling with his pride. Then, with a deep exhale, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe I've been carrying this anger too long," he muttered, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "Maybe it's not about you at all." Around them, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively. The barista, who had been frozen with uncertainty just moments ago, finally set her tray down on the counter and offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, their tension easing as they returned to their coffee cups. It was as though the entire room had been holding on to the man's anger, and his admission was a release that everyone could feel. Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not easy to let go of that kind of weight," he said, "but maybe talking about it, sharing it, makes it a little lighter." The man looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to find a crack in Barron's calm exterior. But there was nothing to find, just sincerity. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You're a good kid," he said, almost reluctantly, as if the admission cost him something. "I don't say that often." Barron smiled, a genuine expression that softened the sharp angles of his face. "Thank you," he said simply. What happened next took everyone by surprise. The man extended his hand across the table, his fingers trembling slightly, whether from nerves or emotion. It wasn't clear. Barron hesitated only for a moment before clasping the man's hand firmly. The handshake was brief but powerful, a physical manifestation of the unspoken understanding they had reached. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "for judging you before I even knew you. And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way," Barron replied, his tone as genuine as his expression. The handshake lingered for a moment before the man released it, sitting back in his chair. He glanced around the cafe, noticing for the first time how many people were watching. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but it didn't last. Instead, he stood, smoothing his shirt awkwardly as he prepared to leave. Before he turned to go, the man looked back at Barron. "I think I owe everyone here an apology too," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "I came in here angry, at the world, at people like you, at everything. But this kid, he gestured toward Barron, his tone softening. He reminded me that sometimes we just need to listen. For a moment, the cafe was silent. Then, slowly, a quiet ripple of applause spread through the room. It wasn't loud or theatrical, just a heartfelt acknowledgement of what had just transpired. The man nodded, visibly moved, and made his way to the door. As he reached it, he paused and turned back one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a sincerity that left no room for doubt. And then he was gone. The door closed softly behind him, leaving the cafe in a hushed, reflective silence. Conversations slowly resumed, but they weren't the same. There was a new energy in the room, a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. Patrons who had been strangers just minutes ago were now exchanging smiles, their interactions imbued with a quiet warmth. A man at the counter offered to pay for the drink of the person behind him. A young woman held the door open for a mother balancing a stroller and a coffee cup. Small acts of kindness, seemingly insignificant on their own, began to ripple through the cafe. Barron, meanwhile, returned to his seat. He picked up his book and took a sip of his now cold tea, but his mind lingered on the encounter. He couldn't help but glance out the window, wondering where the man had gone and what he was thinking now. Though they might never meet again, Barron felt a quiet sense of fulfillment knowing that, for a moment, they had truly connected. As he turned back to his book, a woman from a nearby table approached him. She looked to be in her 60s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Young man," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle weight of gratitude, "I just want to say what you did back there was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to turn things around." Barron nodded, his expression humble. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied. "I think we all just want to be heard." The woman smiled and returned to her seat, leaving Barron to his thoughts. Around him, the cafe buzzed with quiet conversation, the atmosphere lighter now than it had been when he first walked in. People were smiling at one another, striking up conversations, and offering small gestures of goodwill. The tension that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by a sense of shared humanity. As Barron gathered his things and left the cafe, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. The man's anger, his story, and their brief but meaningful connection had changed not only the tone of the room, but also something within Barron himself. He realized how small acts, listening, understanding, extending a hand, could create ripples far beyond the moment. Walking down the busy Philadelphia street, Barron smiled to himself. Maybe that's all it takes sometimes, he thought. Just a little empathy to remind us we're not so different after all. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the cafe behind him continued to buzz with the quiet echoes of a moment that none of its patrons would soon forget. You've just witnessed how a simple willingness to listen can transform lives. At Stories That Heal, we believe in the power of connection to break down barriers. If this story moved you, please share it and subscribe for more real-life moments that inspire. Let's continue to spread kindness, one story at a time. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of Healing, Understanding, and Connection.